The rain wasn't just falling, it was a physical weight, a liquid wall slamming against the cockpit of the F-16 Fighting Falcon. Captain Eva Valkyrie Rostova felt each drop as a tiny hammer against the canopy, the sound a deafening, rhythmic drumming that vibrated through her bones. Below, the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the Hindu Kush were swallowed by a soupy, impenetrable fog. Her instruments, usually a constellation of reassuring green and amber lights, flickered with uncertainty. The GPS was a ghost, and the comms were a symphony of static, punctuated by the panicked, fading voices of men she was sent to save. Static, no visual. Repeat, we are blind down here. They are everywhere. The voice of SEAL Team 6 leader, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne, callsign Ours, was a distorted growl. Eaten alive by the storm, Eva keyed her MIC, her knuckles white inside her flight gloves. Ours, this is Valkyrie. I'm directly overhead, but this soup is thicker than concrete. I need a laser designation, anything to give me a target. The reply was a burst of static and something that sounded horribly like a muffled explosion. Negative, Valkyrie. We are pinned down in a ravine. Can't break cover. They've got us zeroed in. We are taking heavy, static, the line. Went dead. A cold dread, colder than the freezing air at 20,000 feet, crept up Eva's spine. 6 of America's most elite warriors were being systematically dismantled on a forgotten mountainside, and she was their only lifeline, a lifeline they never wanted. The memory of the pre-mission briefing, just 6 hours earlier at Bagram Airfield, was a fresh, stinging wound. The room had been thick with the smell of stale coffee and testosterone. Colonel Davies, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the grim lines of command, had pointed to a satellite image on the screen. SEAL Team 6 is walking into a hornet's nest, he'd said, his voice gravelly. Intel suggests a high-value target, codenamed Scythe, is meeting with insurgent leaders in this valley. The SEALs will infiltrate, capture or kill, and exfiltrate before sunrise. Air support will be on standby. Valkyrie, you're on watch. Every eye in the room had flicked to her. She was the only woman in the briefing, a fact that usually didn't bother her, but today it felt like a spotlight. Marcus Thorne, a mountain of a man with a jaw that looked like it could crack walnuts, had openly scoffed. He didn't even try to hide it, her. Thorne had asked, not looking at Eva but at the colonel. With all due respect, sir, this is a delicate operation. We need a pilot who's been there, someone who knows the terrain. We need a veteran, not a new face. The insult hung in the air, unspoken but clear. We don't need a woman. We don't need you. Eva's callsign, Valkyrie, had been given to her at flight school. It was meant to be a compliment, a nod to the mythical warrior women who decided the fate of soldiers in battle. But in moments like this, it felt like a joke. She had aced every simulation, broken records in training, and graduated at the top of her class from the Air Force Academy. She had flown combat missions over Syria and Iraq. But to men like Thorne, she would always be a risk, an unknown quantity, a box to be ticked for diversity quotas. Her own wingman, Captain Raptor Evans, a pilot she respected, had tried to defend her. She's the best we've got on short notice, Marcus. Her reaction times are off the charts. Thorne had just shaken his head, a dismissive smirk playing on his lips. Reaction times don't mean a thing when you're flying blind in a storm over those mountains. Experience does. He had turned to the colonel. I'll take my chances with the terrain over a rookie pilot, sir. We'll keep radio silence unless it's absolutely necessary. The message was clear. Don't call us, we'll call you. And we don't plan on calling now. They were calling. Or they had been. The silence on the comms was more terrifying than their frantic shouts. Eva circled the coordinates, her fuel gauge dipping steadily toward the red. The storm was a living entity, a malevolent beast that clawed at a jet, trying to rip it from the sky. Every instinct screamed to her to turn back, to ascend above the weather and wait for instructions that would never come. Protocol demanded it. Self-preservation demanded it. But the memory of Thorne's smirk, the casual, cutting dismissal in his eyes, burned hotter than her afterburner. This wasn't just about a mission anymore. It was about every woman who had ever been told she wasn't good enough, every pilot who had been judged on their gender instead of their skill. It was about the 6 men down there who, despite their arrogance, were still her brothers in arms. Ours, this is Valkyrie, talk to me, she repeated, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil in her gut. Give me anything. A muzzle flash. A direction. Anything. Only Static answered. She made a decision, a reckless, career-ending, and potentially fatal decision. She was going down. She was going to punch through the fog. Raptor, I'm descending, she said into the secondary channel, her voice low. And firm. Maintain altitude and act as my eyes up here. Relay any intel from command. Valkyrie, negative. Raptor's voice was sharp with alarm. You can't fly in that. The terrain is a death trap. You'll be sheared apart before you see the ground. They won't last another 10 minutes, Raptor. I'm their only shot. Eva, don't, he pleaded, using her real name for the first time since they'd been deployed. This is suicide. She ignored him, her focus narrowing to the instruments in front of her. She pushed the stick forward, and the F-16, a marvel of engineering and lethality, began its descent into the swirling grey abyss. The world outside her canopy dissolved. There was no up, no down, just an endless, disorienting whiteness. Her altimeter began to unwind at a terrifying rate. 20,000 feet. 15,000. 10,000. The jet bucked and shuddered. An alarm blared, the terrain-following radar screaming a proximity warning. She was flying blind, hurtling toward a mountain she couldn't see. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the roar of the engine. She could feel the granite peaks reaching for her, invisible fingers ready to tear her from sky. This was insane. Thorne's words echoed in her mind. Reaction times don't mean a thing. Was he right? Was this a rookie mistake born of pride? At 5,000 feet, she was still in the soup. The proximity alarm was a constant, piercing shriek. Her own breathing was ragged in her ears. Pull up, Eva, pull up. A voice in her head screamed, but another voice, a quieter, deeper one, whispered, not yet. She held her course, her eyes scanning the void, searching for a break, a flicker of light, anything. 4,000 feet. 3,000. The alarm was deafening. Her hands were slick with sweat. She was seconds from impact. Then, she saw it. A brief, violent pinprick of orange light, far below and to her left. A muzzle flash. It was there for a fraction of a second, a single spark in the overwhelming grey, but it was enough. She had a direction. She banked the jet hard, pulling GS that threatened to send her into a blackout. The F-16 groaned in protest, but it responded. A true extension of her will. She leveled out, her eyes fixed on the spot where she'd seen the flash. She was now flying parallel to the ravine floor, but she still couldn't see it. The fog was a suffocating blanket. Ours, I saw a muzzle flash, she transmitted, praying her signal could pierce the storm. I'm coming in low. Pop smoke if you can. Any color. Silence, she had to risk it. She armed her main cannon, the 20mm Vulcan, a weapon capable of firing 6,000 rounds a minute. Firing blind was a court-martial offense. If she was wrong, if she hit the seals, her career and her life would be over. But if she did nothing, they would die anyway. She took a deep breath, her finger hovering over the trigger. She pictured the ravine, the muzzle flash, the likely position of the enemy fighters. It was a calculation based on instinct, training, and a desperate, terrifying guess. Suddenly, a new light appeared on her radar, a fast-moving blip ascending directly toward her. It wasn't a friendly. It was a surface-to-air missile, the calm, automated voice of the jet's warning system filled the cockpit. Missile. Missile. Evade. She had been so focused on the ground, she hadn't seen the launch. They had baited her, drawn her in low. The muzzle flash wasn't just an enemy fighter, it was a trap. She jammed the stick to the side, deploying. Flares, silver-hot decoys designed to fool the missile's heat-seeking guidance system. The F-16 screamed through the fog, a wounded animal trying to shake a predator. The missile was closing fast. She could feel its presence, a deadly promise of heat and shrapnel just behind her tail. She pulled back on the stick, a gut-wrenching climb that pushed her deep into her seat. The G-force was immense, the world turning into a grey, blurry tunnel. She had to get above the missile to make it lose her in the clouds, but as she ascended, a horrifying realization dawned on her. The missile wasn't the only threat. Her radar lit up with 2 more contacts, descending from above. They had been waiting for her, hiding in the storm. 2 enemy fighters, diving straight for her. She had flown into the perfect ambush. Pinned. between a missile from below and two jets from above, trapped in a fog that made her both blind and a perfect target. She was out of options, out of altitude, and out of time. Down below, Marcus Thorne and his men heard the roar of her engine, a sound that briefly cut through the chaos of their firefight. They looked up, but saw nothing but the swirling grey mist. The sound was a ghost, a phantom hope. Then they heard another sound, a high-pitched whistle that was growing louder by the second. It was the sound of a missile locking on, followed by the terrifying, unmistakable roar of two more jet engines joining the fray. The SEALs didn't know who the pilot was. They just knew that their only chance of survival was now caught in a 3-on-1 dogfight in the middle of a hurricane, completely blind. The sounds from the sky told them everything they needed to know. Their air support was being torn apart. Hope, which had flickered for a brief moment, was extinguished. They were alone. Eva saw the enemy fighters break through the cloud cover above her, their silhouettes like sharks in the water. They opened fire, cannon rounds ripping through the air around her cockpit. The sound was like a zipper being torn, open right next to her ear. She evaded, diving back down into the suffocating fog, the missile from below still screaming toward her. There was nowhere to run. The comms crackled to life, but it wasn't Raptor's voice. It was a calm, chillingly clear voice, speaking in perfect English but with a thick Russian accent. "Valkyrie," the voice said, as if he knew her call sign, as if he knew her personally. "Nowhere to run, little bird. The sky belongs to us today." The voice was coming from one of the enemy jets. He wasn't just trying to shoot her down. He was hunting her. And he knew her name. The blood in her veins turned to ice. This wasn't a random encounter. This was personal. But how? Who was he? The question was a new, terrifying layer to the impossible situation she was in. She was fighting not just for her life and the lives of the SEALs, but against a ghost who knew her in the dark. The Russian's voice was a shard of ice in the chaos. "Nowhere to run, little bird." It echoed in Eva's helmet, a chilling counterpoint to the blaring missile alert and the percussive thump 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 of her own heart. How did he know her call sign? The question was a venomous hook, snagging her focus when she needed it most. She had no time to dwell on it. The missile from below was a rabid dog, closing the last few hundred feet to her tail. The two fighters above were repositioning, ready to pounce the moment she evaded. It was a classic pincer movement, executed with lethal precision. Think, Eva, think. Her training kicked in, a lifetime of simulations and drills coalescing into a single, desperate gamble. She couldn't go up. She couldn't go sideways. So she had to go down. Deeper, she pushed the stick forward again, a death-defying dive back toward the granite teeth of the mountains. The proximity alarm shrieked, a solid, unbroken tone of imminent impact. She was using the terrain as a shield, forcing the missile to follow her into the narrow, winding ravines she still couldn't see. It was a move that required absolute faith in her instruments and a healthy dose of insanity. "Come on, you monster," she whispered to her jet, the words a prayer to the machine. "Don't fail me now." She watched the missile's tracking signal on her display. It was still locked on, but its trajectory was becoming erratic. The missile's simple brain was struggling to compute the radical change in altitude and the confusing radar echoes bouncing off the canyon walls. Just as the altimeter screamed past 500 feet, she did the unthinkable. She cut her afterburner. The sudden deceleration was violent, throwing her forward against her straps. The F-16, starved of its immense thrust, shuddered. For a heart-stopping second, she felt the jet wobble, threatening to stall and drop from the sky like a stone. But the maneuver had its intended effect. The heat-seeking missile, locked onto the massive plume of her afterburner, suddenly lost its primary target. It shot past her, its guidance system confused by the abrupt change in her heat signature. A heartbeat later, the missile slammed into the canyon wall just ahead of her. The explosion was immense, a blossoming fireball of orange and black that momentarily illuminated the fog. For the first time, Eva saw the world outside her canopy. She was inside a narrow, winding canyon, the rock walls so close she felt she could reach out and touch them. The sight was both terrifying and beautiful. She had survived the missile. But the two fighters were still above her, and now she was trapped in the canyon. "Impressive, Valkyrie," the Russian's voice crackled over the radio, laced with what sounded like genuine admiration. "But you've only caged yourself. A bird in a cage is still just a bird." The two enemy jets, advanced Su-35s by their silhouette, descended to the canyon's rim, like vultures circling a kill. They wouldn't follow her in. They didn't need to. They could simply patrol the entrance and wait for her to run out of fuel or make a mistake. Down in the ravine, the SEALs had been thrown to the ground by the shockwave of the missile impact. The explosion had been deafeningly close. Marcus Thorne pushed himself up, his ears ringing. He had seen the fireball paint the fog, had heard the shriek of the F-16 as it dove. What the hell was that? One of his men, a young medic named Doc Ramirez, shouted over the gunfire. That was our air support, buying us a few seconds. Thorne yelled back, laying down suppressing fire with his rifle. The enemy fighters had been momentarily distracted by the dogfight above, giving the SEALs a brief respite. But now the pressure was returning, the crack of bullets echoing off the rocks around them. They are trapped. We are still on our own. The sense of hopelessness returned, heavier than before. Their pilot was a ghost, fighting a battle they couldn't see, and from the sounds of it, she was losing. Eva, meanwhile, was using the canyon to her advantage. The narrow walls blocked the enemy's radar, making it impossible for them to get a missile lock. But it also blocked her own communications. She was cut off from Raptor, from Bagram, from everyone. She was truly alone with the hunters. She flew the F-16 through the winding canyon, a high-stakes slalom at over 500 miles per hour. It was the most difficult flying of her life, a test of pure instinct and skill. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation, and she would be a smear of burning metal on the rocks. She had to find a way out. And she had to get back to the SEALs. She remembered the satellite images from the briefing. The ravine the SEALs were in was part of a larger network of canyons. If she could find the right tributary, she could circle back, pop up behind the enemy, and maybe, just maybe, even the odds.it was a long shot, a map etched in her memory against a reality she could only see a few hundred feet at a time. She scanned the canyon walls, looking for the opening she had seen on the map, a narrow split in the rock that led to a parallel valley. There, a dark fissure to her right. It was barely wider than her wingspan. Here we go, she muttered, and banked the jet into the gap. The wings of the F-16 almost scraped the rock. The sound of the displaced air was a physical roar. She was inside a tunnel of stone, the sky just a sliver of grey light above her. She flew through the passage for what felt like an eternity. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the glow of her cockpit. Then, the canyon opened up again. She was in the parallel valley. She had done it. She stayed low, using the terrain as cover, and pushed her speed, racing back toward the coordinates of the SEAL's last known position. She had a plan, a desperate, audacious plan. The two Su-35s were still circling the entrance to the first canyon, confident their prey was trapped. The Russian pilot, who called himself Sokol, Falcon, was patient. He had studied the American pilot. He knew her record, her training, her call sign. He had been sent here specifically to intercept her. The high-value target, Scythe, was not a man, but a piece of technology, a next-generation stealth drone jammer. And Sokol's mission was to ensure the Americans never got their hands on it, and to eliminate the pilot who had been sent to protect the recovery team. He had underestimated her once. He would not do it again. She's quiet, his wingman noted over their private channel. She's thinking, Sokol replied. Let her think. The more fuel she burns, the easier this will be. He was wrong. Eva wasn't just thinking. She was preparing. She re-emerged from the canyon network like a wraith, coming up behind and below the two enemy fighters. They never saw her coming. Fox 2, she said calmly, the command to fire a heat-seeking missile. She fired one, then immediately banked, and fired a second. The two Sidewinder missiles screamed off their rails, beautiful, deadly streaks of white smoke against the grey sky. Sokol's cockpit lit up with warnings. Missiles. Brake left, he yelled to his wingman. They broke, deploying flares, but it was too late. Eva's attack was perfectly timed, perfectly executed. The first missile slammed into the wingman's engine. The Su-35 erupted in a ball of fire, tumbling from the sky. The second missile, aimed at Sokol, was thrown off by his flares. It detonated harmlessly a few hundred feet from his jet. The odds were even. One-on-one, you were full of surprises, Valkyrie, Sokol's voice came over the radio, no longer calm, but tight with fury. But a cornered rat is still a rat. He threw his jet into a tight, high G turn, coming around to face her. The dogfight began in earnest. The two jets were a whirlwind of motion and violence above the storm-shrouded mountains. They twisted and turned, climbed, and dove, each pilot testing the limits of their machine and their own body. Eva knew the Su-35 was more maneuverable at high altitudes, but she had the advantage in the thick, soupy air of the lower atmosphere. She had to keep him low, to drag him back into her world. She dove back toward the canyon, and as she expected, he followed. He was arrogant, overconfident, eager for revenge. He wouldn't let her escape into the rocks again. This time, she wasn't. Running. She was leading him, down in the ravine. The SEALs heard the second explosion as the wingman's jet went down. A flicker of hope ignited in Marcus Thorne's chest. Their pilot, whoever she was still in the fight. Pop smoke, he yelled. Now. Green smoke. Doc Ramirez fumbled for a smoke grenade, pulled the pin, and threw it into the center of their small, rocky perimeter. A thick plume of emerald green smoke began to billow upwards, a fragile signal in the overwhelming grey. Eva saw it. A faint wisp of color, barely visible through the fog. It was exactly what she needed. "Ars, this is Valkyrie," she transmitted. Her voice strained from the G-forces. "I see your smoke. I'm on my way. But I'm bringing a friend with me." She was flying at treetop level, with Sokol hot on her tail. His cannon rounds were stitching lines in the rock and dirt around her. She was deliberately letting him get closer, luring him into the kill box. She flew directly over the SEALs. Position. For a split second, they saw her, a grey phantom roaring through the mist, so close they could see the rivets on her fuselage. And right behind her was the enemy. "She's leading him right to us." One of the SEALs screamed. "Is she crazy?" Thorne didn't answer. He just watched, his knuckles white on his rifle. He was finally beginning to understand. This wasn't a rookie mistake. This was a calculated, terrifyingly brilliant maneuver. As she passed over the ravine, Eva did something that defied all logic and training. She slammed on her air brakes and cut her engine to idle. The F-16 decelerated with impossible speed. Sokol, caught completely by surprise, had no time to react. He shot past her, his sleek jet suddenly in front of her, a perfect, unavoidable target. Eva's finger was already on the trigger. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding and squeezed. The Vulcan cannon erupted, a torrent of 20mm rounds that tore through the air. The sound was a physical shockwave. The rounds found their mark, ripping into the Su-35's engines and fuselage. The enemy jet shuddered, a plume of black smoke pouring from its tail. It was mortally wounded, but not dead. Sokol was fighting for control, his jet spiraling toward the ground. But as he fell, he managed to fire one last, desperate shot. Not a missile. Not a cannon round. It was something else. A small, dark object that detached from his plane and shot toward the ravine wall, directly above the SEAL's position. It wasn't an attack. It was a deployment. The object hit the rock and adhered to it, a small, black box with a blinking red light. Eva, pulling out of her maneuver, saw it. Her blood ran cold. It was the jammer. The scythe. The very technology they had been sent to capture. Sokol hadn't been trying to escape with it. He had been trying to activate it. A low hum began to fill the air, a sound that seemed to vibrate in Eva's teeth. Her screens and instruments went haywire. The GPS, the radar, the comms, everything dissolved into a waterfall of useless, garbled data. The jammer wasn't just blocking stealth capabilities. It was a wide-spectrum electronic warfare device. It was frying every piece of advanced technology in the valley, including the guidance systems on her F-16. She was flying a dead stick. A 20-ton, multi-million-dollar glider, surrounded by mountains, in a fog so thick she couldn't see her own. Wingtips down below, the SEALs' high-tech gear went dead. Their night vision, their comms, their digital scopes, all useless. They were plunged into a primitive, terrifying silence, armed with nothing but their rifles and their wits, and the enemy, who had been held back by their superior technology, knew it. A new sound echoed through the ravine, a sound that was not gunfire. It was a triumphant, chilling roar from hundreds of enemy fighters, who now began to swarm forward, no longer afraid. The tide had turned in an instant. Eva fought to control her jet, her hands gripping the useless stick. She was blind, deaf, and falling from the sky. The last thing she heard before her own comms died completely was Sokol's voice, distorted and breaking up, but filled with a cold, final victory. "Checkmate, Valkyrie." The silence in Eva's cockpit was a living thing. It was heavier than the G-forces, louder than the screaming alarms that had just been snuffed out. The vibrant, glowing life of her heads-up display had been replaced by a black, dead screen. The friendly hum of the avionics was gone, leaving only the whisper of wind over the canopy and the terrifyingly quiet rumble of an engine she could no longer trust. She was flying analog in a digital world, a ghost in her own machine, the Scythe. Jammer was more powerful than anything Intel had briefed them on. It wasn't just a jammer, it was an electronic plague. It had ripped the soul out of her aircraft, leaving behind a hollow metal shell. Her first instinct was to panic, to eject and surrender herself to the storm and the enemy below. But the image of Thorne's dismissive smirk, the echo of Sokol's triumphant checkmate, solidified into a core of pure, unadulterated rage. This was not how her story ended. She fell back on the most basic principles of flight, the stick and rudder skills that had been drilled into her since her first day in a tiny Cessna. She could still control the plane's surfaces, the ailerons, the rudder, the elevators. She still had thrust. She was flying by the seat of her pants, a phrase that had never felt so terrifyingly literal. She had one advantage, the fog. It had been her prison, but now it was a shield. Sokol, his own jet crippled and falling, wouldn't be able to see her. The swarm of enemy fighters on the ground were blind to her position. She was a phantom, hurtling through the grey void, and she had to use that to her advantage. Her mission had changed. It was no longer about air support. It was about taking out that jammer. If she didn't, the SEALs were as good as dead, and this new, terrifying weapon would find its way into the hands of America's worst enemies. But how do you destroy a target you can't see, can't lock onto, and can't even communicate with? Down in the ravine, Marcus Thorne was experiencing his own version of technological death. His comms were dead. His team's advanced optics were useless black screens. The digital battlefield map that gave them situational awareness was gone. They were back in the Dark Ages, surrounded and outnumbered. The enemy's celebratory roar was followed by a disciplined, coordinated advance. These weren't just disorganized insurgents. They moved with a chilling efficiency, using the terrain, bounding from cover to cover, their iron sights glinting in the dim light. They were being led by someone who knew what they were doing, back to basics. Thorne bellowed, his voice raw. Iron sights. Conserve your ammo. Make every shot count. The SEALs formed a tight perimeter, their backs to a rock wall, a small pocket of defiance against a rising tide. The familiar, terrifying symphony of battle erupted again, but this time it was different. The sharp, high-tech crack of their M4S was answered by the deeper, more numerous bark of AK-47s. It was a brutal, primitive calculus of numbers, and the SEALs were on the losing side of the equation. Doc Ramirez was hit first, a round grazing his shoulder. He grunted, packed the wound, and kept firing. They were all taking fire, the rocks around them chipping and spitting fragments of stone. They were a dwindling island in a sea of enemies. Thorne knew they had minutes, maybe less. His mind raced, searching for an option, any option. And then he looked up, at the small, blinking red light of the Scythe jammer, perched on the cliff face like a malevolent eye. That was the source of their misery. That was the target. But it was 100 feet up a sheer rock face, under heavy fire. An impossible target. He looked at his men, their faces grim, streaked with mud and resolve. They were the best in the world, but even the best could be overwhelmed. For the first time in his long and storied career, Marcus Thorne felt the cold, bitter taste of true hopelessness. He had led his men into a trap from which there was no escape, and the pilot he had so arrogantly dismissed was likely a crater on a mountainside. The guilt was a lead weight in his gut. He had been wrong. So horribly, fatally wrong, above the chaos, Eva was in a desperate race against time and physics. She knew the jammer's location, but her weapons were useless without their guidance systems. Her bombs were dumb, her missiles were blind. Her Vulcan cannon was her only viable weapon, but a strafing run in this fog, in this canyon, was suicide. She needed a landmark, a point of reference. She needed to see. She began a slow, careful climb, pulling the F-16 up through the thickest layers of the fog. She watched the external temperature gauge, a simple, analog dial that was blessedly still working. As she climbed, the temperature dropped. She was looking for the freezing line, the altitude where the rain would turn to ice-ed at 18,000 feet. She found it. The canopy in front of her began to frost over. This was a chance. She pushed the jet into a shallow dive, building speed. Then, she pulled up sharply, an abrupt, vertical climb. The maneuver forced the jet to bleed speed rapidly. As it slowed, it began to fall backward, tail first, a maneuver known as a tail slide. It was an incredibly dangerous and disorienting airshow stunt, one that had no place in a combat zone, but Eva wasn't showing off. She was thinking as the F-16 slid backward, hanging in the air for a few precious seconds, stalled between gravity and momentum. She had a moment of relative stillness. And in that moment, she looked down. The maneuver had been so abrupt, it had created a vortex in the air around her, a temporary disruption in the thick cloud layer. For a single, breathtaking second, a hole opened in the fog beneath her and she saw it. The entire valley laid out below her like a map. The winding canyon, the river, the flashes of gunfire in the ravine. And on the cliff face, a tiny, pulsing red light. The image was burned into her memory. The hole in the clouds closed as quickly as it had opened, and the jet, now pointing nose down, began to plummet toward the earth. She wrestled with the controls. The engine screaming as she pulled out of the dive, the G-forces threatening to tear the wings off, but she had what she needed. A visual. A target fixed in her mind's eye. Now came the hard part. The attack run. She knew she would only have one shot. She had to fly down the canyon, blind, using the mental map she had just acquired, and fire at the precise moment, at the precise angle, to hit a target the size of a briefcase from over a mile away, with an unguided weapon. It was impossible. She took a deep, steadying breath. She thought of her father, a crop duster in rural Nebraska, who taught her how to fly. He used to tell her, "Don't fly the plane, honey. Feel it. Feel the wind, feel the ground. It's a dance." She had to dance with the devil in the fog. She began her descent, lining up her approach based on the memory of the valley. She ignored the useless instruments, focusing on the feel of the jet, the subtle shifts in air pressure, the faint echoes of the engine sound bouncing off the canyon walls. She was flying by senses she didn't know she possessed. Down below, the SEAL's perimeter was shrinking. They were down to their last few magazines. The enemy was getting bolder, closing in for the final assault. Thorne saw a figure, larger than the others, directing the attack from the rear. The leader. He was calm, professional, pointing and gesturing, orchestrating the battle like a conductor leading a symphony of death. Thorne raised his rifle, took aim with his iron sights, and squeezed the trigger. The figure dropped. For a moment, the enemy attack faltered. But only for a moment. A new leader emerged, and the assault resumed with even greater ferocity. They were crawling over their own dead to get to the SEALs. "It's over, boys," Thorne said, his voice heavy with a resignation. He never thought he'd feel. Make 'em pay for every inch. And then they heard it. A low rumble that grew into a deafening roar. It was the sound of a jet engine, closer than ever before. Eva's F-16 burst out of the fog at the end of the canyon, a grey angel of vengeance screaming toward them at point-blank range. She was 100 feet off the ground, her landing gear up, her wings practically scraping the rock. The enemy fighters looked up, their faces a mixture of shock and terror. They had assumed the jet was gone. They raised their rifles, a futile gesture against the oncoming storm of steel. Eva's eyes were fixed on the cliff face, on the spot where she knew the jammer was. She couldn't see the blinking red light from this angle, but she didn't need to. She had the picture in her head. She was painting by memory. Now, her thumb depressed the trigger. The Vulcan cannon roared to life. A stream of incandescent tracer rounds, brighter than magnesium, shot across the ravine. It was a solid line of light and destruction, a surgeon's scalpel wielded with brutal force. The rounds walked up the cliff face, a series of small explosions that chewed through the rock. For a horrifying second, she thought she had missed. The stream of fire was just to the right of her mental target, but she had accounted for the wind. At the last possible second, the stream of bullets drifted, corrected by the crosswind she had felt on her descent. The tracer round slammed into the scythe jammer. The small black box erupted in a shower of sparks and a flash of blue-white electrical energy. The blinking red light went dark. The low hum that had saturated the valley floor vanished, and in Eva's cockpit, the world came back to life. Her screens flickered on, one by one. The GPS reacquired its signal. The comms crackled, flooded with the frantic, relieved voice of Raptor. "Valkyrie, you're alive. I'm reading you. What is your status?" The SEAL's gear surged back to life as well. Their comms buzzed, their optics glowed green. The digital battlefield map reappeared, showing a terrifying number of enemy signatures surrounding them. But now, they could fight back on their own terms. The enemy, however, had one last surprise. The destruction of the jammer seemed to trigger something else. From a hidden cave high up on the opposite side of the ravine, a new weapon was revealed. It was a multiple-launch rocket system, its tubes already angling down toward the SEAL's position. It wasn't a primitive, insurgent weapon. It was a modern, sophisticated piece of military hardware. This wasn't just a group of insurgents. This was a well-equipped, well-funded army. Before Eva could even react, before the SEALs could process the new threat, the rockets fired. A salvo of a dozen high-explosive warheads screamed across the canyon, a fiery, unstoppable barrage aimed directly at the small pocket of American soldiers. There was no time to evade, no time to run for cover. Eva watched in horror, her heart seizing in her chest. She had saved them from one threat, only to lead them into a more spectacular and more final death. The rockets were seconds from impact. The comms were suddenly filled with Marcus Thorne's voice, not panicked, but filled with a strange, calm sense of awe and terror. "Valkyrie," he said, his voice crystal clear now. "What did you just lead us into?" The dozen rockets streaked across the ravine, their fiery tails painting lines of death against the grey sky. For the men of SEAL Team 6, time seemed to slow to a crawl. They could see the individual warheads, ugly, brutish cones of metal, arcing directly toward their position. There was no escape. This was the end, a brutal, anonymous death on a forgotten mountainside. Marcus Thorne instinctively shielded his head, a futile gesture against the coming apocalypse. He closed his eyes, a flash of his daughter's smiling face his last thought. Did I in the cockpit of her F-16? Eva Rostova screamed a wordless denial. She had just pulled them back from the brink, only to watch them be obliterated. Her mind, supercharged with adrenaline, processed the impossible geometry of the situation. The rockets were too fast, too numerous. Her cannon wouldn't be able to track them, and her missiles needed time to lock on. There was nothing she could do but as the rockets reached the apex of their arc and began their descent, something extraordinary happened. They wobbled. Their trajectories became erratic, unstable. One veered sharply to the left, slamming harmlessly into the canyon wall. Another shot straight up, exploding in a premature fireball. A third tumbled end over end, crashing into the river below. One by one, the rockets failed, their guidance systems shorting out, their flight paths becoming chaotic. Of the 12 that were fired, only 2 hit anywhere near the SEALs, and they were far enough off target that the soldiers were only peppered with dirt and rock fragments from the explosions. They were alive. Battered, deafened, but alive. Thorne opened his eyes, his ears ringing, his body trembling with residual shock. He looked at the smoking craters where the rockets had landed, then at the still intact rock face that had been their shelter. It didn't make any sense. It was a miracle. Eva, watching from above, knew it wasn't a miracle. It was the scythe. When she had destroyed the jammer, it hadn't just shut down. The catastrophic overload had sent out a final, massive electromagnetic pulse, an EMP, a wave of pure energy that had fried the unshielded, sophisticated guidance chips in the enemy's rockets. Her impossible shot had not only restored their technology, it had created a momentary shield against the enemies. It was a 1 in a million chance, a fluke of physics and timing that had saved all their lives. Valkyrie, what the hell just happened? Thorne's voice crackled in her ear, a mixture of disbelief and awe. I think I accidentally broke their toys. Ours, she replied, her own voice shaky with relief. She banked the F-16, turning her attention to the rocket launcher's position. Now it's my turn. The enemy soldiers who had manned the launcher were staring in stunned confusion at their smoldering, useless weapon. They didn't have time to react. Eva's jet screamed down the canyon, and this time, her systems were fully operational. Fox 3, she said, unleashing an air-to-ground Maverick missile. The missile shot off its rail, a smart weapon that needed no guidance from her. It locked onto the heat signature of the launcher and flew a perfect, direct path. The explosion was catastrophic, engulfing the entire cave mouth in a ball of fire and rock. The secondary explosions of the remaining rockets inside the cave sent a shockwave echoing through the valley. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the battle was far from over. The enemy on the ground, though shaken, was still numerous and determined. They had been robbed of their high-tech advantage, but they still had the numbers. They regrouped. Their initial shock turning to a furious, desperate rage. "Valkyrie, we're not out of this yet," Thorne reported, his voice now all business. "They are dug in deep. We need to find their command structure. Taking out the foot soldiers is like swatting flies. We need to find the nest." "Working on it," Eva said. She ascended, climbing above the ravine to get a better view of the battlefield. Her tactical display was now a clear, detailed map of the area, populated with dozens of red icons representing enemy forces. They were spread out, hidden in caves and behind rock formations. A direct frontal assault would be a meat grinder. She needed to think like they did. Where would she put a command post? Somewhere defensible. Somewhere with a view of the entire battlefield. Her eyes were drawn to a ridge overlooking the ravine, a high point that offered a perfect vantage point. It was heavily fortified, according to her senses. But there was something else, something that didn't fit. A heat signature that was different from the others. It was larger, more stable, and partially shielded. It wasn't a vehicle. It wasn't a group of soldiers. It was a structure. A small, prefabricated communications hut, cleverly camouflaged among the rocks. That was it. That was the nerve center, ours. "I've got a potential CNC bunker on the ridge overlooking your position," she relayed. "It's heavily defended. I can't get a clean shot with a missile without risking a rock slide that could bury you." "So we are back to square one," Thorne said, his voice tight with frustration. "Not exactly," Eva replied. A new plan was forming in her mind, even more audacious than the last. "I'm going to need you to do something for me. I need you to make some noise. A lot of noise. Draw their attention to the west end of the ravine." "What are you planning, Valkyrie?" "Just trust me," she said, the words leaving her lips before she could stop them. A week ago, a man like Thorne would have laughed in her face. But now, there was only a moment's hesitation. "You heard her," Thorne yelled to his men. "Light up the west wall. Suppressing fire. Go." The SEALs unleashed a torrent of fire, concentrating their attack on the far end of the canyon. The enemy, as expected, responded, shifting their focus, moving to counter the perceived assault. While their attention was diverted, Eva began her approach. But she didn't come from the air. She came from the ground. She dropped her F-16 too. An altitude so low it was terrifying, flying with her wheels just a few feet above the winding river that snaked through the valley floor. She was using the canyon itself as a shield, flying below the enemy's line of sight. Her radar was useless this low, and she was once again flying on pure instinct, the rock walls a blur on either side of her. She was approaching the command bunker from its blind spot, from the one direction they would never expect. From directly below it. As she neared the position, she did something that would have made her flight instructor's hair turn white. She engaged her afterburner. The sudden, explosive acceleration in the narrow canyon was like firing a cannon in a closet. The sound was a physical force, a shockwave of thunder that shattered rocks and shook the very foundations of the mountain. The F-16 leaped forward, a caged beast unleashed. She pulled back on the stick at the last possible second, a vertical climb that was almost instantaneous. The jet shot up the cliff face, a grey streak of defiance against the stone. The soldiers guarding the command bunker looked down in sheer disbelief as the nose of a fully armed F-16 appeared just a few feet from their faces. They had been looking at the sky, at the horizon, not straight down. They had no time to even raise their weapons. Eva was now flying straight up, perpendicular to the ground. Through her canopy, she could see the command hut directly in front of her. She was close enough to see the satellite dish on its roof, the guards frozen in a tableau of shock. She didn't fire a missile. She didn't use her cannon. She used a weapon that was far more subtle and far more brilliant. She engaged her electronic warfare suite, focusing a tight, high-energy beam of microwave radiation directly at the command hut's communications array. It was the electronic equivalent of a surgical strike. The effect was immediate. The complex electronics inside the hut were fried, not with a massive EMP, but with a precise, targeted burst of energy. The enemy's ability to communicate, to coordinate their forces, was severed in an instant. The brain of the enemy army was dead. The foot soldiers on the ground, suddenly cut off from their leaders, were thrown into confusion. Their disciplined attack dissolved into chaos. Some continued to fire wildly, while others hesitated, looking for orders that would never come. Eva continued her vertical climb, rolling the jet onto its back at the apex of her ascent and diving back down into the safety of the canyon. The entire maneuver had taken less than 10 seconds. Dai had been a masterpiece of flying, a breathtaking display of skill and courage, and it had broken the back of the enemy assault. But as she leveled out, a new warning light flashed on her console. It wasn't an enemy threat. It was her fuel gauge. It was blinking a final, angry red. Her high speed, low-altitude flight and her repeated use of the afterburner had drunk her tanks dry. She had minutes of flight time left, not nearly enough. To make it back to Bagram, she was a hero. And she was stranded. "Raptor, this is Valkyrie," she said, her voice heavy with a sudden, crushing exhaustion. "I'm bingo fuel. I'm not going to make it back." "I'm on my way, Eva." Raptor's voice was frantic. "I'm pushing it. Just try to find a clear spot, something flat." Eva looked at the terrain around her. Flat spots were not a feature of the Hindu Kush. It was all jagged peaks and bottomless ravines. Ejecting here would be a death sentence. Down below, the SEALs were taking advantage of the enemy's confusion, pressing their attack, moving from defense to offense. They were routing the enemy, a stunning turn of events. They were winning. Thorn, in the midst of the firefight, heard Eva's transmission. His heart sank. The woman who had saved them, the pilot he had mocked, was going to die out here because of them. And then he heard another voice on the comms. A voice that made his blood run cold. It was the Russian pilot, Sokol. His jet was crippled, but he had clearly managed to eject. And he was on the ground, using a handheld radio. "Did you hear that, Valkyrie?" Sokol's voice was a triumphant sneer, filled with a chilling, personal hatred. "You're out of gas. A bird that cannot fly. I am coming for you, little bird. The scythe is not the only prize I was sent to collect today. My government wants the pilot who destroyed it. They want you." A new red icon appeared on Eva's tactical map. A friendly icon. A downed pilot emergency beacon. It wasn't hers. It was Sokol's. He was on the ground, less than 2 miles from her current position. And he wasn't alone. The red icons of the remaining enemy forces were no longer fleeing. They were converging on Sokol's position. They weren't retreating. They were regrouping. And their new mission was to hunt and capture the American pilot who was about to fall out of the sky. Eva looked at her fuel gauge, then at the map. Her jet was dying. Her enemies were waiting. And the storm was closing in again, the fog thickening, promising to swallow the mountains once more. She was out of fuel, out of altitude, and out of time. And the hunter she had shot down was now hunting her. The blinking red fuel light was a death sentence. Eva Rostova had faced down missiles, enemy fighters, and impossible odds, but she couldn't defeat the simple, brutal physics of fuel consumption. Her F-16, her chariot of fire, was turning into her coffin. Below, a landscape of jagged, unforgiving rock waited to claim her. "Ars, I'm going to have to put her down," she said into the comms, her voice a mask of calm over a sea of adrenaline. "I'm looking for a stretch of riverbed. Anything that's not a vertical cliff." "Negative, Valkyrie," Marcus Thorne's voice shot back, sharp and commanding. "You are not putting her down. You are coming home. All of us." The conviction in his voice was a shock. This was not the same man who had dismissed her in the briefing room. This was a man whose voice carried the weight of a promise. "I've got an idea," Thorne continued, his words coming fast. "It's insane. It's probably going to get us all killed. But it's the only shot we've got. Get yourself over the highest peak to your east. There's a plateau on the other side. It's not a runway, but it's the flattest piece of hell you're going to find in this country." Eva looked at her map. The peak Thorne was talking about was K2 West, a monster of rock and ice. To get over it, she would have to trade her last drops of fuel for altitude in a desperate, powerless climb. A glide path to a plateau she couldn't see. It was a pilot's nightmare. "And what happens when I get there?" she asked, her voice tight. "Sokol and his friends will be waiting for me." "So will we," Thorne said simply. The SEALs were moving. They were no longer just soldiers fighting for survival. They were a rescue team. They fought with a renewed, ferocious purpose, pushing through the disorganized remnants of the enemy force, heading for the plateau. They were coming for her. Eva made her decision. She turned the nose of her jet toward the massive peak and pushed the throttle to its maximum. The afterburner kicked in one last time, a final, glorious roar of defiance. The F-16 surged upward, climbing, clawing for every inch of altitude. She watched the fuel gauge hit absolute zero. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then died. The silence was absolute. She was now the pilot of a 20-ton glider. At the mercy of the wind and gravity, she cleared the peak, the belly of her jet just scraping the summit. Below her, as Thorne had promised, was a small, windswept plateau, and descending upon it from all sides were the enemy soldiers, a net closing around her landing zone. In the center of them, she could see a lone figure, Sokol, his face turned to the sky, waiting. She began her descent, a long, graceful, terrifyingly silent glide. She had no power, no second chances. She had to get this right day as she neared the ground. She dropped her landing gear. Without hydraulics, she had to use the emergency nitrogen blowdown system, a one-shot deal. The gear locked into place with a reassuring clunk. The plateau rushed up to meet her. She flared the jet, pulling the nose up to bleed off speed. The wheels touched down, not on smooth tarmac, but on rock and frozen dirt. The landing was brutal, a bone-jarring, teeth-rattling skid. The F-16 bounced, veered wildly, and threatened to cartwheel. She fought the rudder, her muscles screaming in protest, wrestling the dying beast into submission. The jet slid to a stop less than 100 yards from the cliff edge. She had done it. She was on the ground. Alive, she popped the canopy, the cold mountain air a shock to her system. And then she saw them. Dozens of enemy fighters, forming a circle around her, their rifles all pointed at her. Sokol stood before them, a grim, triumphant smile on his face. He held a pistol, and it was aimed directly at her cockpit. "Checkmate. Valkyrie," he said again, his voice no longer a disembodied radio transmission, but a physical presence in the thin air. "I told you I would collect you." Eva's hand went to the small service pistol strapped to her vest. It was a futile gesture. It was over, but then, a new sound. The sharp, unmistakable crack of a high-powered sniper rifle echoed from the peaks above. One of the soldiers standing next to Sokol dropped, a neat, perfect hole in his helmet. Then another crack. And another. The SEALs had arrived. They had taken up positions in the rocks overlooking the plateau, turning the enemy's trap into their own kill box. Thorne's voice erupted over the radio, which Eva still had in her helmet. "Valkyrie, get down." Sokol's face contorted in rage. His perfect victory was being stolen from him. He turned his pistol from Eva and fired wildly at the rocks where the sniper shots were coming from. It was a fatal mistake. In that moment of distraction, he took his eyes off his true target. Eva didn't hesitate. She drew her pistol, and with a speed and precision that would have made a gunslinger proud, she fired. Her single shot was true, hitting Sokol squarely in the shoulder of his gun arm. He cried out, dropping his pistol. The battle for the plateau was short and brutal. The SEALs, masters of their craft, dismantled the enemy force with terrifying efficiency. Caught in the open, with their leader wounded and their morale broken, the insurgents had no chance. When the last shot had been fired, a profound silence fell over the mountain. The SEALs emerged from the rocks, moving toward the downed F-16. Marcus Thorne was the first to reach her. He looked up at Eva, still sitting in the cockpit, her pistol smoking. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at her, his face a mixture of awe, respect, and a deep, profound gratitude. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a humility that seemed to sit uncomfortably on his broad shoulders. He started, then stopped, as if the words were failing him. "I was wrong about you, Captain. You and a lot of other people." "Commander," Eva said, her voice steady, though her hands were shaking. He nodded, a small, tight gesture. "No one is ever going to be wrong about you again. I'll make sure of that." He offered a hand. "Welcome to the ground, Valkyrie." She took his hand and climbed out of the cockpit, her legs unsteady beneath her. She was home, but the story wasn't over. As the SEALs secured the prisoners, including a wounded and spitting Sokol, Doc Ramirez made a discovery. He had been examining the scythe technology, the pieces of the jammer that had been blown off the cliff. "Commander, you need to see this," he called out. Thorne and Eva walked over. Ramirez was holding a shattered circuit board. On it, clearly, stamped beneath the Cyrillic lettering of a Russian manufacturer, was a small, almost invisible logo. It was the logo of a major American defense contractor. The betrayal was staggering. The most advanced piece of enemy electronic warfare, they had ever encountered was built with American components. Someone on their own side had sold them out, had supplied the enemy with the very technology that had almost killed them all. Sokol wasn't just an enemy pilot, he was a customer. This mission wasn't just about a battle, it was about treason. At the highest levels, the realization hit them all like a physical blow. They had won the fight, but the war had just taken on a new, more sinister dimension. Their enemy wasn't just in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. They were back home. In the boardrooms and corridors of Power.as, the rescue helicopters finally arrived. Their rotors beating a hopeful rhythm against the cold air, Eva looked out. At the vast, hostile landscape. She had earned their respect. She had found a strength in herself she never knew she possessed. But she had also uncovered a snake, a conspiracy that reached far beyond this remote battlefield. She climbed into the helicopter, the SEALs following her, a new, unbreakable bond, forged between them in the fire of combat. As the chopper lifted off, Marcus Thorne caught her eye. He gave her a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the new fight that lay ahead of them. Her battle in the fog was over, but her war was just beginning. She had torn through the sky to save them, but now she would have to tear through a web of lies and betrayal to save her country. And she would do it, because she was Valkyrie, and her ascent had only just begun.